My good people, thank you for joining us on another FCPO DIY. Today, we're going to be working on a 2011 Porsche 911S. Today on the 911 behind me, we're going to be covering how to replace the rear brake pads and rotors. Working with me today are the Zimmerman and Ate pad set that we have on the website. This includes all the hardware needed to do both sides. Today we're going to be focusing on the passenger rear. However, the driver's side is going to be identical. You're going to have wear sensors for both sides, wear pad shims, your new hardware, rotor set screws, and caliper hardware as well. A couple things to look for when doing your rear brakes. You always want to inspect them before you get into them, especially if you're not sure what the history is on them. For the car behind us, as far as we know, they've been on the car for the last 40,000 miles. They're starting to show their age. A couple things you can look for is simply how much pad life is left on your brake pads. Secondly is just a visual inspection on the rotors. As they get older, they're going to develop a lip, usually on the inboard and outboard side of them. Same thing front and back. So you can just run your fingernail across the front of them and see if you can catch a lip. That way you can know it's time to replace them. Another thing to know is these typically last anywhere between 30 to 70,000 miles. It all depends on how you drive your car and where you drive your car. If you're going to track your car, obviously they're going to last a little bit less than if you just use it to commute. Again, all depends on your driving habits. Before we get started on this DIY though, let's take a look at some of the tools we're going to need for this job. And now for tools. For this job, we have a couple different torque wrenches that we're going to be working with, a 1/2 inch and a 3/8 inch drive. We have a 3/8 drive ratchet. We have a couple caliper hooks. We have a T55. We have a hex 10 millimeter, a 19 millimeter socket for our lug bolts, 2 different sized flatheads and a Phillips head screwdriver. We have a hammer and a punch. And then a couple nice to haves is a set of pliers, a little wire brush, and a caliper piston spreader tool. And if you have them on hand, an electric impact gun and an electric ratchet makes things a little bit quicker and easier. Now we have our tools covered, let's get started on this DIY. Before we get started, I like to always go ahead and check out the fluid reservoir for our brakes. This one's a little bit past the max full line, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and remove a little bit of brake fluid with an extractor so that when I compress my caliper pistons in, I'm not overflowing this too much or forcing fluid out. So instead I'll just take off a little bit, and then once we're done with the job, we can top off again if needed. And that should do us for now. Probably a little bit overkill, but it doesn't hurt. I'm going to leave this like this. Now let's head over to the wheel and get started on this brake job. Thank you for joining us at the rear of this 911. Today we're going to be working on the lift. However, this is a job you can easily do in the driveway or in the garage with a floor jack and a couple jack stands. So whatever you do, just be safe. To get started, a 19 millimeter socket to get our lug bolts off. All right, my people, we have the wheel off. Before we do anything, because this is a New England car, I'm going to go ahead and put some penetrating fluid on both rotor set screws here. Now, while we let that soak, let's go ahead and get started by removing our brake pad wear sensor. To do that, on the rear, the clip is at the very top of the knuckle here. You're simply going to want to lift up that metal tab. Go ahead and pull out your sensor. It's going to feed through this metal clip here. It just slides up. Next, we can go ahead and pull our wear pad sensors out of the brake pads. It's okay if you break them, if you're replacing them. We recommend you do. They're pretty inexpensive. Next, we're going to want to go ahead and remove the cotter pin that holds our pin in place, that keeps our pads in their home. I'm just going to take a flathead screwdriver, pry it up. Then I'm going to take a small punch and my hammer, and I'm going to punch the old pin through. Now, before I go ahead and take the pads out, I like to use the old pads when I'm replacing both the pads and the rotors as a tool to help compress the pistons a bit. Now we can go ahead and take our flathead and just put it through the hole where the pin goes and pull towards you on the outboard. And you're going to do the same. We're going to push towards the inside with the inboard pad. And then it's a matter of just prying the pads as far back as you can while shoving the flathead in between the rotor and the pad. Again, if you're not replacing your rotors, I highly recommend you do not do this. But since we're replacing everything today, not a big deal. One thing to know, as you do this, you are going to be causing some pressure between the two onboard and outboard side of pistons, so you may have to go back and forth until you get them both evenly pushed back. Another thing you could do is leave one flathead jammed in one side while you work on the other. At this point, we should have more than enough room. We can always go in with our retractor tool and compress the pistons more. These will just pull right out. Now from here, we're gonna go ahead and work on freeing up our rotor before we remove the caliper, just to have the caliper as a bit of insurance, keep the rotor from falling on our feet. I'm gonna take a Phillips head screwdriver and a hammer, and I'm just gonna go ahead and give it a couple whacks to shock the set screw and hopefully break it free if there's any corrosion that's holding it there. Now I'm not gonna take the second one out all the way, I'm just gonna leave it there. That's gonna hold it when I go to remove it. One thing to note, the old hardware on the caliper here is gonna be a T55. Our new one is a 10mm hex. So just keep that in mind. If yours have not been updated, you might have to get two different sockets. So again, our old stuff is a T55 on my 3/8 drive ratchet. It's gonna break those free. Now with that, we can go ahead and set these off to the side. If you have a way to do so, you can go ahead and set up some caliper hooks. We're gonna do that right now. Now, before I go ahead and pull the rotor off, I need to go ahead and free it up. To do that, I like to take a screwdriver, usually a flathead, and shove it in between the vanes of the rotor. Just work it back and forth, just like that. Make sure you have your parking brake off in the rear. You don't want to fight that the whole time you're taking these off. With that off, I'm going to take my wire brush and just go ahead and clean up this hub a little bit. Before we go any further, I'm going to go ahead and work on removing these old shims from the caliper. I'm just going to take a flathead and pry them out. Again, just like the fronts, if you followed along on our other video, the shims are both different sizes. They have different diameter clips, so there's no real way to mix them up. Just pop all 4 of those off and get our 4 new ones on. So I'm going to start by matching up what size I need for what. So the bigger diameter shim goes towards the bottom on the inboard, and same thing with the outboard. And then the smaller diameter shim goes on the up top on both inboard and outboard sides. When you put these in, I recommend you pop them in first. Once you have them in, then you can go ahead and take off the sticky backing. Now with everything cleaned up, our shims back in the caliper, we're gonna go ahead and get ready to put our new rotor on. Before I do so, I'm gonna go ahead and take some liquid moly ceramic paste and just coat the back where the rotor meets the hub, mainly due to the fact that this is a New England car and I'm hoping that it doesn't seize on for the next time these have to come off. Just a quick tip, when you're going to install a new rotor like this that has a zinc coating on it, you want to try and avoid getting it all greasy, as you don't want to hit them with brake clean. That will go ahead and ruin the finish on them, so kind of defeats the purpose. So I got a fresh set of gloves on. I'm going to go ahead and mount these into place. With our set screws in place, I always like to take a little bit of that same compound and just coat the front of them in hopes that it'll help keep some moisture out so that they don't marry themselves to the front of the rotor. It's not an art project, you don't have to get crazy with it. Now with that done, we can go ahead and mount our caliper back onto our hub. I'm going to lose the caliper hook. Just gently slide that back over here. Take our new hardware. Again, as mentioned earlier, the old hardware was a T55. The new hardware is going to require a 10mm hex. Now that we have those on, I'm going to take my ratchet just to zap them on and snug them up quickly. Now we're going to go ahead and torque these down to 63 foot-pounds. With that done, we can go ahead and insert our new brake pads. The pads are going to be identical for the inboard and outboard, so don't worry about screwing them up. Don't worry about mixing them up. Next, we're going to take our new pin and hardware. Just note, if you forgot how they came off, the little hook is always facing up. That's where your brake pad wear sensor routes through. Just going to sit something like that. Start feeding the new pin through. Push down with your thumbs. Bam, baby. Now we can go ahead and install our new cotter pin. This is definitely not the old one. Now we're going to go ahead and start by installing our new wear pad sensor. Note the orientation of the clips. They only go in one way. The one with the red shielding is your outboard. Feed it over our clip, and then we can go ahead and insert our sensor on the inboard pad. You'll feel a click. That's how you know it's in its home. Then you can feed the sheathing through the caliper. Back over. Don't forget about the metal clip here. You're going to want to route it through that once you've reconnected it. Just like that. Close the top. Feed it through. Beautiful. And if you want to be extra, this should probably be routed through the brake leader valve. Looks like whoever did this last did not do that. So we'll go ahead and take care of that now. With that buttoned up, we can now go ahead and install our wheel. Next, I'm just going to snug them up with the impact, and then we're going to torque them down to 95 foot-pounds. And there you have it, my good people. Another DIY in the books. Overall, a pretty straightforward job, the rear brake pad and rotor replacement on the 911. If you like this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments on what we did today, leave those in the comment box below. And if you like this DIY and you want to see more like them, please consider subscribing. We make new ones all the time. As always, thank you for watching. We'll catch you in the next one.